David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We're back. It's 2018. Hope everybody had a good new year. I am here. Pat is here. We will hear on today's bonus show about yet another one of Pat's zany and bizarre road trips. This one, though, fortunately did not lead to significant car trouble.
No?
At least as far as he has told me. I'll talk to you about my vacation as well. But it is 2018, and the left really has to start focusing on the midterm elections now. And when I say the left, I don't necessarily mean just Democrats or the Democratic Party, but I'm talking about the left when it comes to progressive and liberal voters. And this includes focusing on the races themselves, but this also means paying attention to concerns about voting technology and voting laws that might suppress the vote all over the country at the local and state level. And we've talked before with, who have we talked with? Brad Friedman, for one, from Bradblog, and others, about this lack of interest in voter suppression until it's very close to the election. So we've got 10 months, and it's not like I'm telling you anything new, but in addition to paying attention to the races that are out there for the midterms, we need to be paying attention to attempts to suppress the vote that are taking place all over the country. For everyone who talks about the resistance against the Trump regime, and they connect that to the Russia investigation and maybe the impeachment or resignation or Donald Trump or the emoluments clause or Trump suffering from dementia, whatever else, right? Put that aside for a moment, because the one method of resistance that we can directly control is just voting them out. And I've been talking about this, right? The Russia investigation depends on what Robert Mueller or the Senate or impeachment proceedings, charges, prosecutions, indictments. We can't control a lot of that. Using the 25th Amendment to remove Donald Trump from office because of dementia or some other inability to serve in a fit way depends on countless factors, many of which we have no control over other than pressuring public officials. And that's an uphill battle I wouldn't really be holding my breath for. Voting, we can all vote, and voter turnout it's very low in the United States in general. It's extra low in midterm elections, and we can vote them out, and they can't do anything about that if we turn up, assuming that there's not egregious voter suppression, which actually changes the outcome compared to the will of the people. But again, we're focusing on that as well. So as I've said before, voting them out has to be the top priority, and we can start working on that right now. So big picture, a few important points to hit. First of all, stop paying attention now to the broad, generic ballot polls for congressional approval and congressional elections, right? Yes, if you look at many of the generic ballot polls right now, it looks just fantastic for Democrats, right? One example is the 538 generic ballot poll. And by generic ballot poll, we mean it's not about a particular race, but it's about voting for Democrats or Republicans in the midterm election. Democrats 49.9%, Republicans 37%. And a couple reasons that you don't want to pay attention to that. Number one is that there's still a lot of people who are not in there, right? If you add up 49 and 37, you don't get 100. And that's because there's a lot of undecideds, and that's why you don't really want to pay attention to that lead. And number two, whether it's the 538 poll or the Politico Morning Consult poll, which also says Dems are up double digits in a generic ballot for 2018, that tells us nothing about anything relevant to our activism, in the sense that not all senators are up for re-election. Those polls are not adjusted for the base level party split of different districts and states. It's not in any way something we need to make any decisions about, because it doesn't matter when it comes to individual races. What is up for grabs on November 6th? Well, all 435 House seats, as is always the case every 2 years. 33 of the 100 seats in the Senate. 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election it's 6 years, right? Yeah, that makes sense, every 6 years.
Well, 1/3 every 2 years.
I'm sorry, 1/3, the full Senate is every 6 years. Yes, 1/3 is up every 2 years. I'm sorry, I said it in a more confusing way than I needed to. 33 seats in the Senate, 39 state and territorial governorships. This is huge, but not all races are created equal. Look, for example, at the map of Senate races that are upcoming. When you look at this map, you will see that most of the Senate races that are up in 2018 are Democratic incumbents, some of whom are up for re-election, some of whom are retiring. Way fewer Senate races are Republican incumbents or Republican retirees. Democrats have way more seats to defend in 2018, which is what makes that poll about, oh, Dems have a huge advantage. It's a distraction. Dems have way more to lose and to defend here. And I promised that we would start digging into this early in 2018. Today's our first show of the year, and we're going to. Now, is there one strategy for the left? No. In some places, primarying an incumbent Democratic senator might be the correct decision. And we've talked about this, Pat, in the context of some of these activist movements that want to focus exclusively on primarying Democrats rather than making a sort of more holistic analysis of what makes sense in this particular state.
Right, because you have a limited number of resources, right?
Yes.
And if there's a seat up for grabs in, say, Mississippi, which is very, very red,
Yep.
are you going to run the progressive Democrat or maybe just someone who's in the middle of the road but has an actual chance of winning there?
You have to take a pragmatic approach, and that's why in some places you might want to primary the Democrat. In other places, you might say, instead of primarying the Democratic senator, let's try to flip 3 House seats that are now in close districts as a result of the disaffected voters with Donald Trump, for example. If there are specific races that you in the audience think that we should be covering, please let me know. And this gets me to something else. We've already been getting, and now we're getting way more requests than we ever have, requests from candidates for interviews. And sometimes it's pre-primary, okay? Before they've won a primary, someone says, I'm running in the Democratic primary for the 17th District of California or whatever. This is a tough thing for us, actually, because we have to balance wanting to inform the public about many of these great candidates with the reality that we can't just start doing primary interviews for each race, right? As a baseline, our audience doesn't like interviews with political candidates or elected officials. Anytime we interview an elected official or candidate, Pat, the interviews don't do that well. You
Yeah,
know
and I mean,
that.
if someone's running for the 3rd district in California,
Yeah.
by and large, our audience is not there, right? I mean, there are very few in our audience that live in that district.
That's right. And the difference with the Roy Moore election was all the focus was on that. And people around the country were activating around that one race. When every seat is up for re-election, I just don't know what the right thing is. I don't want to do this thing where I ignore every candidate until after the primaries. But we also can't do all these pre-primary interviews. I don't know what the answer is, okay? So I'm asking you in the audience, as we get closer and closer to the November 6th election, should we develop some policy where we say no pre-primary interviews when there's an incumbent Democrat, but yes, when it's a Republican? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but I'm open to hearing from you because I don't want to make the show something that people aren't looking forward to anymore because they don't want to hear from yet another Democratic challenger in X, Y, or Z district. So anyway, let me know your thoughts, and we're going to be digging in a lot of detail to a lot of these races as they come up. Okay, it's 2018. We are just a couple of weeks from the 1-year anniversary of Donald Trump being president of the United States. That's a quarter of his term almost. And now he's been in office long enough that we can start making some broader assessments of what's happened so far. And I feel so conflicted about the 1-year mark. Because on the one hand, I can't believe it's been a year, right? It's flown by. It feels like we just had the election, right? But on the other hand, I'm so fatigued by the constant scandals and embarrassments that it kind of feels like it's been 8 years.
I feel like so much has happened, though. You know,
Exactly,
I feel like
yeah.
it's been a lot longer.
So 3 areas that I want to talk about. Bills passed. How much legislation has Donald Trump accomplished? His approval rating. How is he doing in the opinion of the public? And golf trips. Not because golfing is important, but because during the presidency of Barack Obama, Donald Trump was very focused on how much President Obama was golfing and how much he would not be golfing if he were ever president of the United States. So let's talk first about legislation. Donald Trump says, he claims, he asserts, that he has signed more legislation into law than any other president during their first year. The truth happens to be the exact opposite of that. The nonpartisan govtrack.us website says that Donald Trump has signed the fewest bills into law of any recent president dating all the way back to Eisenhower, okay? Numerous media outlets tried to get clarification from the White House. Trump says he has the most bills. Evidence and records say the fewest bills. How do you explain that? No answer from the White House so far. That's legislation. How about approval rating? At the end of his first year, Donald Trump's approval rating is the lowest of any president during the modern polling era. And we actually have a list here, and you'll see that George W. Bush at the end of his first year was polling 86%, JFK 77%, Bush 1 71%, Eisenhower 69%, Nixon 59, Carter 57, Obama 54, Clinton 54, Reagan 49, and Donald Trump most recently, according to a CNN poll, the same CNN poll, 35%. Not too good. But hey, the polls are all fake news, so it's not real, right? And lastly, golfing. During Obama's presidency, Donald Trump slammed President Obama for golfing too much. During his campaign, Donald Trump said he wouldn't have any time for golfing, he wouldn't be leaving the White House very much, and yet Donald Trump has golfed 88 times so far at a taxpayer cost of more than $42 million. And compared to other presidents, Trump has golfed more than any modern president. As far as the golf itself goes, yeah, it's a huge disrespect to the taxpayer, since this is all happening with taxpayer money at Trump's own golf courses, funneling millions of dollars into his own family's businesses. But in a sense, Trump golfing means he's not legislating, which is arguably a good thing. But still, the taxpayer money going directly into Trump's family businesses, it's unacceptable. There will probably never be consequences for Trump for funneling these millions of dollars into his businesses through golfing. I'm just being realistic, but it's an absolute and total disrespect to the taxpayer. The really funny or sad thing, and in this presidency, the line between funny and sad has become pretty blurred in ways I never before thought possible. The funny or sad thing is that Trump thinks he's working hard, right? And his core base actually believes it. Over the vacation, I watched very little news and paid attention to very few things. But when I was on vacation, I saw these interviews. I think it was CNN did it with in deep Trump territory. And it also happened to be a pretty poor part of the country. I don't know if it was rural Florida or Mississippi or something. It was just total cognitive dissonance, right? People were asked, how do you think Trump's doing? Oh, he's just working so hard for us. Really, for you? Are you happy with the tax plan? Some of these voters were asked, and they said, yeah, we really are. And then they were asked, well, hold on, isn't Trump's tax plan mostly for the rich? And the respondents actually said, completely unsarcastically, with absolutely no hint of satire or understanding of the reality, the tax breaks for the rich make sense because poor people don't create jobs. Rich people create jobs. So it's good that the rich are getting the tax cuts. They're going to create jobs for people like us. Total cognitive dissonance.
I mean, they can explain away anything. I mean, they'd actually probably be happy with him signing fewer bills than any modern president.
Right.
Because they think that the government that governs least is the government that governs best, right?
Well, that's why either way they're going to support what he does, right? If Trump says executive orders and tons of legislative accomplishments, they support the president enacting his agenda. If he does nothing, they support a president who adheres to small government principles of not doing too much.
Yeah, but the approval ratings and the golfing are a lot harder for them to respond to.
True.
I mean, maybe they can point to a Rasmussen poll that has them at 47%.
Yeah.
But the golf hypocrisy, there's just no comeback to that.
We cannot reach these folks, is the conclusion I've come to. Everything we know about cognitive psychology and behavioral economics about cognitive dissonance tells us that these are people that we are not going to reach effectively in a way that might actually swing an election, which gets me back to something I've been saying for a year at this point, and I even said in the first story on today's program, the first show back in 2018, in the context of the midterms. We need to focus on getting out the vote because voter turnout is so low. You're not going to convince these folks, and by voter turnout alone, we can actually win in 2018 if we're willing to do the work. Send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. We are back. Yes, it is a new show. No more vacation shows. No more repeats. We've dragged Pat back into the studio, and we are doing a show. We'll take a break and be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day, first new member of the day of 2018, is Chris Shearman. Chris, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. Membership grew by leaps and bounds in 2017, and I'm thrilled to say that because of a big membership special that we ran yesterday on January 1st, 2018, we are off to a strong start in 2018, and I want to thank Chris and also thank all of our patrons as well. Those are the primary two ways that this program is funded. Membership at davidpakman.com/membership and Patreon at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. And we are also now accepting crypto contributions and more people getting involved in Bitcoin and the like. And you can find out more about that at davidpakman.com/cryptocurrency. I mentioned on the last show of 2017, which feels like it was a long time ago now, actually, that we would not be selling David Pakman Show 2018 calendars deep into 2018. And we're very close to totally wrapped up. We have 7 calendars left. We have, at this point, it's just what's left from the orders that we've made of calendars. I have 7 calendars left, okay? If you want one of these last 7 calendars, and the calendar is made of 100% original art from 3 different David Pakman Show viewers, an original cover from Dan Burke, as well as some comic strips by Dan Burke, and other images, including a hybrid image that was put together in concert between Corey Topkis and Anthony Petramala. And I know that Corey was not thrilled with this bastardization of his Andy Warhol-esque image.
Oh, yeah.
But for a number of different logistical reasons, it had to happen this way with Anthony Petramala's help. So I think it actually all came together really nicely.
Artists are very particular about that stuff.
Oh yeah, you don't want to bother an artist with changes to their work, and so we took some liberties in putting this thing together. Anyway, we have 7 of these calendars left. 2 ways to get them, and they're both at davidpakman.com/calendar18. Okay, if you want to get the calendar for free and autographed with a new David Pakman Show yearly membership, you can do it at davidpakman.com/calendar18. If you want just the calendar, and it can be autographed or not, you also do it at davidpakman.com/calendar18. How will you know if we still have any of these 7 calendars remaining? If you go to davidpakman.com/calendar18 and you are allowed to order a calendar, then that means we still have some of those 7 remaining. If you go to that page and it says 2018 calendar sales have ended, then you will know that's it. And there are no more calendars until next year if we do this, which at this point I think we should. It's been 4 or 5 years in a row. It's kind of becoming a tradition.
It is a tradition.
Yeah.
I mean, how are you going to end that?
I guess just
Unless
by
there's
never
reason to.
by not mentioning it and hoping nobody notices. But
Yeah.
that didn't work in 2017. People demanded a 2018 calendar. Okay, so check that out, davidpakman.com/calendar18. 7 calendars left. Okay, let's get into some of the recent political stories. A lot of stuff happened over the vacation that I want to talk about, and some of the things that happened we will talk about today, and others we will catch up on during the week. We know that Donald Trump generally cannot stay on script. And in fact, it could even be argued that the entire Russia investigation as it exists today only exists because of Trump going off script, extraneous, unnecessary tweets, unnecessary firings, whatever. So long story short, it's bad when Trump isn't as controlled as possible by staff, which is only at best ever a moderate level of control. Well, at Mar-a-Lago during our end of the year break, where Trump obviously, where else is Trump going to be at the end of the year or at any time other than his own clubs and playing golf at his own golf clubs?
They call it the Winter White House down there?
Yeah, although it's never really winter down there, interestingly enough. Anyway, a club member named Christopher Ruddy introduced Trump to a New York Times reporter named Michael Schmidt at Mar-a-Lago. And it led to a totally impromptu interview that the White House had no idea Trump was actually doing. The New York Times actually quoted a Trump White House official who was asked about Trump's interview with the New York Times, and the Trump White House official responded, "What interview? Today?" Another official called the total lack of organization and coordination for this interview, quote, embarrassing. Now, you might be saying, what happened in the interview? Because unless Trump said something that was embarrassing, it's not really an embarrassment. Well, it was really, really bad. In this interview, again, impromptu interview at his golf club, White House staffers knew nothing about it. Trump told the New York Times reporter that he has the, quote, absolute right to do whatever he wants about the Robert Mueller Russia investigation. He started talking completely incoherently about Russia democratic collusion. I guess the idea is if you lie big enough, at least in the minds of some, it becomes the truth. And Schmidt rightly tried to ask him, hey, you said that the investigation would be over by now, and it isn't. What about that? And Donald Trump comes up with this, just a beauty, to quote Trump himself. that it's actually the Democrats that colluded with Russia. Let's look at a bit of a transcript from this interview. Schmidt says, but in terms of the lawyer said it would be done by, your guy said it would be done by Thanksgiving, it would be done by Christmas. What are they telling you now? What are they telling you? And Donald Trump said, there was tremendous collusion on behalf of the Russians and the Democrats. There was no collusion with respect to my campaign. I think I'll be treated fairly. Timing-wise, I can't tell you. I just don't know. But I think we'll be treated fairly. Later in the same interview, Trump went back to this idea yet again. Another piece of the interview, Donald Trump saying, but there is tremendous collusion with the Russians and with the Democratic Party, including all of the stuff with the, and then whatever happened to the Pakistani guy that had the two, whatever happened to this Pakistani guy who worked with the DNC. Then possibly the crowning moment of the interview as a sort of authentically Trump interview, he did one of his total word salad rants to try to explain away the entire Russia investigation, along with the 4 indictments to date, as phony and a Democratic cover-up for Hillary Clinton losing. This will sound like a run-on mess when I read it to you, and it is. I just want you to know this is what Trump said. It's not me messing up the read of it, okay? During the interview, Trump says, so for the purposes of what's going on with this phony Russian deal, which, by the way, you've heard me say it is only an excuse for losing an election that they should have won because it's very hard for a Republican to win the Electoral College, okay? You start off with New York, California, and Illinois against you. That means you have to run the East Coast, which I did, and everything else, which I did, and then won Wisconsin and Michigan. So the Democrats, they thought there was no way for a Republican, not me, a Republican, to win the Electoral College. Well, they're inaudible. They made the Russian story up as a hoax, as a ruse, as an excuse for losing an election that in theory Democrats should always win with the Electoral College. The Electoral College is so much better suited to the Democrats, but it didn't work out that way. And I will tell you, they cannot believe that this became a story. Anyway, it goes on and on. I encourage you to check it out. But it's understandable why the White House is embarrassed about this. And there's other stuff in there, Pat, about tax cuts that's just as silly as you would imagine. But my takeaway is, first of all, there is huge risk to Trump hanging out at his golf clubs because he ends up in these unplanned and uncontrolled interviews with newspapers like the New York Times, which isn't good. And we have to assume that there is an effort being made to control him at the golf clubs, but that any moment where he's uncontrolled, he can't help but run his mouth like this.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting tidbit that this took the White House by surprise, that they didn't know the interview was going to happen.
Sure.
But it's not like if he had known ahead of time, he would have been prepared and would have spoken eloquently. We've seen this before.
No, I think it's more that the damage control apparatus might have been more prepared if the White House had known ahead of time. But yeah, you're right. It's not like Trump would have, in an incredibly graceful and articulate way, explained his position on the Russia investigation.
Maybe he could have spoken with his lawyers or something, right?
Something, yeah. Or maybe have put out some tweets in advance of the interview going out there, preemptively discrediting the failing New York Times. Welcome to 2018 is the message, and it's going to be a very, very interesting year. Another day, another Trump double standard involving what Russia does, or really what any other country does, what any country other than Russia does. Towards the end of our New Year's break, Donald Trump accused China on Twitter of allowing oil to go into North Korea, saying, hey, this is an impediment to solving the North Korean problem. Trump's exact tweet said, caught red-handed, very disappointed that China is allowing oil to go into North Korea. There will never be a friendly solution to the North Korea problem if this continues to happen. Now, before we get to the hypocrisy, I'll mention it's not actually clear that China did what Trump says they did. We don't know at this point whether China did or didn't allow oil to go into North Korea. What we do know is that just 2 days later, a Russian tanker absolutely, definitely fueled up North Korean vessels, as reported by Reuters. Reuters reporting Russian tankers have supplied fuel to North Korea on at least 3 occasions in recent months by transferring cargoes at sea, according to 2 senior Western European security sources, providing an economic lifeline to the secretive communist state. This is a breach of sanctions. Russia doing this directly violates sanctions that are currently in place, but Donald Trump has been completely silent on this. And to be clear, I don't want to be accused of hiding this. There's no evidence right now that it was Russian state actors that did this, but rather these are reports of individual Russian actors choosing to do this. But it still violates sanctions, and certainly the Kremlin is, while not necessarily behind this or endorsing it, they've done nothing about it. They've said nothing about it. So let's break this down sort of into its component pieces. Whether or not this particular China story is true, Donald Trump is actually correct to say, and I've said this before, China is an impediment to solving the North Korean problem. There's no doubt about it. China could be part of a solution, but they're actually part of the problem here. The problem is that if countries helping North Korea get in the way of motivating them to come to the table and maybe be a part of constructive discussions, you've got to criticize Russia for it as well. But this has a further effect. Obviously, Trump is a hypocrite, right? And it always happens to be hypocrisy about not criticizing Russia. It's never Chile that has evaded Donald Trump's criticism. It's not Madagascar or Switzerland that Trump could criticize but chooses not to. It's always Russia. But the bigger impact is that because Trump only slams China and not Russia for effectively the same thing, it actually fuels the right-wing talking point of, well, why aren't we better friends with Russia? After all, they're not doing anything wrong. Well, they are. They are doing things that Trump is slamming other countries for doing, but his acolytes will never hear about it because Trump doesn't mention it when it comes to Russia. Fox and Friends doesn't mention it. That means it might as well not exist to President Trump himself. And that's the problem of the echo chamber that I've been talking about for years now. And speaking of Fox and Friends, it might not be that Trump is choosing not to slam Russia. He probably didn't know Russia did this because Fox and Friends isn't talking about it, and he seems to get a lot of his news from Fox and Friends. We know he gets his daily propaganda file. Twice a day, it's Propaganda O'Clock, where he's only told great things that other media outlets are saying about him. So anyway, it's very depressing, but it connects to this bigger picture I've been talking about, which is that we are never going to convince the committed Trumpists that he is failing at his job. And with 50% voter turnout in the US and a total lack of awareness from the Trumpists about what is even going on, I've run the numbers before, Trump can win with a 27% approval, even less if you fine-tune the math super specifically. That's why I'm worried about 2018. Because even with these very low approval ratings that Donald Trump has, with the historically stunningly low midterm election turnout rates, Donald Trump and Democrats can do really well. And Republicans can do really well in 2018 and in 2020, even with these low approval ratings, which is why we all have to be activating around getting out the vote and the midterms, and we will be doing exactly that. You can discuss this or any other story of interest on our subreddit at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. Very close to 5,000 subscribers on that subreddit, which I think will hit very, very soon, thanks to many of you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
This is sort of a big progressive media story that happened during our vacation, so I want to spend a little time talking about it. The Young Turks founder and host Cenk Uygur resigned from Justice Democrats over some, I guess the best way to characterize them is sexist blogs that he wrote years ago that resurfaced. And I have some thoughts about this, but first I should kind of just lay out for you the basic facts and the moving parts of this. So first and foremost, the Young Turks, it's a progressive independent media network that started just as one show, started by Cenk Uygur. Years ago, it's grown dramatically. A few years ago, they did a $3 to $4 million fundraising round. More recently, they did a $20 million subsequent fundraising round. This is a relatively large, non-huge media company, I guess we would say. For independent media, or at least what started as independent media, they are very, very big. That's the Young Turks. Justice Democrats is a political organization that supports sort of more to the left progressives in elections, and this includes the primarying of Democratic incumbents that they find to be moderate to conservative, not to the left enough, okay? Cenk was involved in founding Justice Democrats. Now, to be 100% clear with you, last time I saw and spoke to Cenk was in October. I've not spoken to him about this. I've not spoken to anyone at the Young Turks about this. And everything I'm going to tell you is my opinion, and the facts are all things I've gleaned from what's publicly available. These blog posts written by Cenk surfaced from the early 2000s on the Rap.com. The Rap.com published them, and Cenk wrote things including that the genetics of women are flawed because they don't want to have sex as often as needed for the human race to get along peaceably. That's one thing Cenk wrote in these unsurfaced or resurfaced blog posts. Cenk wrote in another one that physical intimacy with women should progress in a particular way on date 3, 4, 5 between a man and a woman. He wrote about kissing 23 women and touching, quote, countless breasts in New Orleans during one Mardi Gras. And there were a few other blog posts that were similar statements in the blog post. What did Cenk say about this? He said a few things, okay? Number one, Cenk wrote that when he wrote these things, he was still a conservative, and that he doesn't stand by them any more than he stands by any conservative politics from his past. Cenk also said that the blog posts were exaggerated and that they were written deliberately in a satirical way. And number three, Cenk said that these posts and the statements in the posts have actually absolutely no connection to his views on these issues today. Okay, how much of this resonates with me and how much of it doesn't? Well, number one, Cenk was a conservative growing up, but my understanding was that he was a conservative when he was much younger. So like in 2002, that's 15 years ago, I think he's about 47 now, he would have been 32. I thought that his conservatism was more when he was like in college, but maybe I could be wrong about that. I don't know.
He voted for Al Gore in 2000.
Voted for Al Gore in 2000.
Was conservative at that time, maybe middle of the road.
I don't know. But so that explanation to me is not the strongest one, right? I'm not really sure about that. As far as this is like any other view that I used to have that I no longer stand by, that actually does make sense to me, okay? Because we're talking here about things he thought at the time, but no one has ever accused Cenk of actually having done anything wrong when it comes to his interactions with women, working at the Young Turks for more than 10, 12, I don't even know how many years at this time. We're talking about views he held that he and many others now disagree with. So he eventually resigned from Justice Democrats over this. Should he have resigned from Justice Democrats? Well, it became a major distraction. So in that sense, it probably was hurting the organization that Cenk was still involved. But again, the difference between Cenk and many of the other incidents that we've heard of in media over the last year or two is that Cenk is not accused of having done anything. He had unsavory opinions 20 years ago, opinions he has changed his mind about. I've said before, Pat, and I think you've heard me say this, when I was in high school, I didn't really think transgenderism was legitimate, right? I thought gay, lesbian, bisexual, totally get it, exists across hundreds or even thousands of species, not something that people choose, etc. In my mind, when I was in high school, and even maybe early in college, I questioned the legitimacy of transgenderism. I've since learned more about it and changed my mind. Now, I never blogged about it, but had I written a blog about my views on transgenderism at age 18 and decided to make them satirical in nature or sort of written in a way to create more of a reaction, it probably would be pretty cringeworthy to read that hypothetical blog right now. Now, I never wrote the blog, and more importantly, I never acted on it, right? I never discriminated or insulted anyone based on their transgender status, whatever. If a blog had been written by me when I was 20 and it was surfaced now, should that impact me today? I don't think so. It's a view that I changed my mind about.
And I also got the sense that he was being glib about it, that he didn't actually feel this way. Maybe he was just like a sexually frustrated young man at the time, and he was trying to blame the opposite gender rather than looking inward, I guess.
Maybe so, yeah. And this is not a defense of what he said. I don't know of any people on the left who are defending the content of what Cenk said. In fact, I think it's mostly people on the right that are defending the content of what Cenk said. The group Justice Democrats, though, has now severed ties with Cenk. They also severed ties with Dave Kohler, who's a co-founder of the Young Turks. I've known Dave Kohler for a long time. He was the treasurer of the Justice Democrats, and he also used degrading language in a blog post 14 years ago about some woman that he and, or generally women, that he and Cenk met on a road trip. I don't have anything else to say about Dave Kohler. And then lastly, Kyle Kulinski, who's a friend of our show and host of Secular Talk, who I guess was an advisor or a board member or a co-founder. I'm not exactly sure what his role was at Justice Democrats. He also resigned. I have no thoughts about that. He can do whatever he feels is best for him, period. I know people were emailing in saying, David, will you comment on Kyle Kulinski's resignation? I don't really know what his role or degree of involvement was with Justice Democrats, and he clearly did whatever he thought was best at the time, right?
He was in a very tough position, did what was best for him.
Yeah, I couldn't possibly comment on that. So bottom line, these are cringeworthy blog posts. There are no victims. There are no accusers of Cenk at the Young Turks, which again has been around for 12 years or even longer. I don't know how long. Allegations of wrongdoing are one thing, but people having previously held unsavory opinions, especially when they're very upfront that these are opinions they now find deplorable and no longer hold, to say that that's a disqualifier for progressive involvement or credentials, it is problematic to me. And there are people who are saying this is an example of the left not supporting free speech, Justice Democrats severing ties with Cenk. The right and left both have a history of supporting the speech that they like and not speech that they dislike. And now this movement for absolutism when it comes to free speech has sort of taken hold in some places on the internet. You can find examples of both the left and right becoming authoritarian on the issue of free speech in different instances. This, for me, is not a story about the left and intolerance of different ideas. If anything, it's more a story about how all of these stories have become blended, everything from actual accusations of wrongdoing, sexual assault, or harassment of women, and merely sort of immature and retrograde and unsavory ideas that someone expressed at a certain point. Those are just not the same things, Pat, and I think that's the main point for me.
Yeah, I mean, ever since the Harvey Weinstein thing started, people have been trying to rank, what's worse, what Bill Cosby did versus, maybe Mark Halperin, right, and where it all plays in.
Sure.
But this is a totally separate category because he didn't act on any of this stuff. It was just
exactly
unsavory
right.
comments.
If someone comes forward and says Cenk did act on this, that changes the story. But as of now, that has not happened, and no one is even talking about that as a possibility. There's just zero behind that. Those are my thoughts. If I'm off base here, if I'm blinded or biased by the fact that I've known Cenk since 2008, which is not that much later than when some of these blog posts were written, and there was nothing in 2008 that indicated that he even remotely held these opinions, send me an email and say, David, you were blinded by knowing Cenk. Here is why you should be more critical of what it is that he wrote and what happened here. Send me your thoughts. We'll take a break and be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
You might remember that throughout his entire presidential campaign, Donald Trump talked endlessly about how he would be doing major infrastructure spending. And you might also remember that after that really horrible Amtrak train crash, a train derailment, late in 2017, Trump tweeted that the crash was evidence of the acute need for infrastructure spending. You might remember Trump sent the tweet that, quote, the train accident that just occurred in DuPont, Washington, shows more than ever why our soon-to-be submitted infrastructure plan must be approved quickly. $7 trillion spent in the Middle East, while our roads, bridges, tunnels, railways, and more crumble, not for long. Now, the problem with that tweet, as I pointed out a couple weeks ago when we did the story, was that the crash actually didn't relate to infrastructure spending that Trump planned to do. It was a new train on recently refurbished tracks. But the big picture is still something that was part of Trump's plan, right? Big infrastructure spending. And he even said Amtrak-related infrastructure spending. Just before the end of 2017, Donald Trump decided to stop a $13 billion spending plan, which would have rebuilt an Amtrak passageway from New York to New Jersey. Wait a second. Trump says he wants to do infrastructure spending. There's an Amtrak train there's an Amtrak train crash. Trump then says the crash further points to the need to do infrastructure spending. There's a plan to do that spending, which would improve Amtrak, and Trump cancels the plan? What is going on here? there is one word which might be the key in understanding what happened here. That word is Obama. This was an Obama agreement with the governors of New York and New Jersey, but it has Obama's name on it, so it's a no-go for Trump. There's no real agenda here for Trump other than dismantle everything Obama did, right? If it was Obama's idea, Trump wants it gone, period. Even if it sounds like the same thing that Trump campaigned on doing during his presidential campaign. Could this work to get Trump to support things that we want, right? Hey, Donnie boy, Obama hates single-payer health care. Really? Maybe Trump wants single-payer all of a sudden. By the way, this is also a good opportunity to talk about the Trump infrastructure spending plans as the crony capitalist handouts that they are. A couple weeks ago, when we did the story about the Amtrak crash, and I talked about just the hypocrisy and delusions of Donald Trump on infrastructure, I forgot to mention that even though Trump says he wants to do infrastructure spending, the way he wants to do it would be a major handout to his buddies and a total swamp job, a swamp-filling crony capitalist cherry on top of the Trump agenda, for lack of a better term. So take this all together, right? An irrational and unhinged desire to undo everything Obama did, combined with a desire to put in place more profits for his friends in any place that he can. It's absolute and total chaos. And this is part of the reason that government is not efficient, as efficient as it could be. You have the people on the right who say government is just fundamentally inefficient and it should do a little as possible. We have this endless cycle where as soon as one administration starts moving forward in one area, the next administration cancels it. And you end up spending millions or even billions of dollars starting for, preparing for, and requisitioning supplies or staff for projects that then get canceled for political reasons by the next administration. This is part of the inefficiency of government that the right likes to point to.
Yeah, and Obama did push for infrastructure spending, right? Especially when it came to the stimulus package.
Yep.
But Donald Trump could have gone one step beyond that, right? And maybe if that was his first action as president, trying to push for that, people would have responded favorably, and his approval numbers could be north of 50% by now.
Of course. And instead, it's been just trying to undo anything that President Obama proposed or put in motion or did, combined with basically stepping aside from his broad policy proposals that he campaigned on, many of them just the wall with Mexico. What happened to the wall with Mexico? Is anyone even thinking about the wall with Mexico at this point? It's just abundantly clear that it was all the bamboozling of his base, and it goes back to what? It goes back to how politics are funded. It goes back to campaign finance, Citizens United, and lobbyists and crony capitalism. All roads on any issue we talk about, all train tracks, if that's what you want to call them, it all leads back to those same issues, and we'll be talking about those issues big time in 2018. There's an important concept in critical thinking and in the scientific method and in epistemology, in media literacy, in political theory. It's an important issue really everywhere, which is don't be swayed by anecdotal evidence. Look for large numbers and large sets of data to make analyses. And a common place where all of this comes together in a sort of perfect storm is the safety of commercial aviation, and in particular, American commercial aviation. American commercial aviation is really, really safe. But individual plane crash stories that receive lots of coverage often make people think that flying is much more dangerous than it is. This is similar to acts of terror, mass shootings, which are incredibly disproportionately covered by corporate media, but they actually are not very common events. And this feeling is even more distorted by the fact that lots of these notable reports that get lots of media coverage are of foreign airlines, sometimes from countries with poor aviation safety records, or of small planes, which are a different story altogether. We now have data from 2017, which was the safest year in history for passengers of commercial aviation around the world. TO70 is a Dutch aviation consultancy, and they put together a civil aviation safety review for 2017. There were 2 fatal accidents in small turboprop aircraft, resulting in 13 lives lost in 2017. No jets crashed in commercial passenger service anywhere in 2017. And to be super clear, there are some crashes that aren't included here because the planes are too small to make the cutoff. And in fact, on New Year's Eve, there was a notable crash in Costa Rica where I think 10 Americans plus 2 pilots died. That plane was smaller than the size of the planes that were part of this study. One of the deaths that took place in 2017 was from a tourist standing too close to the runway in a popular plane watching spot in St. Martin, which might have actually been destroyed by the recent hurricanes there. But anyway, historically a very popular plane watching spot. So what does this all tell us? Well, there are still risks with commercial aviation, but there were no fatal incidents during 2017. And this should really make us feel that commercial aviation is very safe. It should not make us think that TSA is doing a stellar job, right? We know that when TSA's methods are tested, something like 95% or 85% in a recent test of banned items get through. This is not about terrorism or that type of safety, but I feel bad sometimes for people who have sort of an irrational fear of flying, and it actually limits their lives pretty significantly based on the false notion that it's much more dangerous than it is. And the truth is, it's way more dangerous to drive to the airport than to get on the plane and fly. That's just the reality of it.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that it's a phobia, right? I don't know if they call it aerophobia or aviophobia,
Yeah,
whatever
something.
it is. But those are just irrational fears. And if you try to point out to people that it's a lot safer than traveling by car,
Yeah.
or there are a lot fewer air crash incidents than there are car crash incidents, it's going to go in one ear and out the other.
Part of it, I think, is control, right? When you're on a plane, you are very, very far from the control of that flight. Whereas if you're in a car, either driving yourself or sitting next to the driver, it might feel as though you can exert more influence over what it is that takes place during the driving. I think maybe that's a factor.
Yeah, and car crashes tend to happen just in a moment, right? Whereas a plane crash, I think there could be quite a few minutes where you know the thing's going
It could.
down.
I mean, it depends on the circumstances for sure. So that's really, really good news. And within the United States, there's also been improvements made to regional aviation safety. One of the bigger issues facing American aviation is that regional airlines are not up to the same standards as the larger carriers, but there have been some big improvements over the last few years. Historically, overworked and underpaid is basically the way to say it for regional airline pilots. There have been changes made there, and since I believe it was a flight to Buffalo on a regional carrier about 8 years ago, that was a horrible, horrible crash, there have not been any of those either. And that's a good thing.
Maybe it's ironic in a way that this was the same year as that United Airlines incident where David Dow was dragged off of that plane. And then after that, there was a pile-on effect where every week we were hearing about something horrible with United Airlines and other companies.
Someone getting punched, a woman on a Southwest flight with a kid getting either kicked off or harassed in some way.
One after another.
On a recent flight on JetBlue, as we were landing, the pilot actually came on and said, we're 20 minutes from Logan Airport, and I want to thank you for flying to us. And now that the safest part of today's journey is almost over, I want to remind everybody to be extra careful driving home from the airport tonight, which was it was a kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of saying this is way safer than driving around in a car. So good news for the aviation industry. And by the way, by the law of small numbers, because there were no crashes in 2017, it's unlikely if there is even one crash, it will be on paper a less safe year than 2017. Although when you look at the number of passenger miles that were flown, even 1 or 2 crashes, tragic, horrible, and we want to avoid them, statistically speaking, would not really be a reflection of a decrease in safety in commercial aviation.
Right, and if you go from 0 crashes to 1 crash, that's like an infinite % increase, right? That's
mathematically, it's not good, but very, very safe. Okay, we've got a voicemail to play for you. Our voicemail number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Let's take a listen to this voicemail that came in.
Hey, David, it's similar to saying we're not anti-Semitic, we have a Jewish lawyer, would be, I don't dislike Jews. I watch the David Pakman show.
Right.
And I just think that would be even funnier to hear it coming out of someone's mouth.
If anyone in the audience is ever told that line, right? I have no problem with Jews whatsoever. I regularly watch the David Pakman show. Please email in and tell me about that, because I absolutely want to hear about that. On today's bonus show, I will talk about my vacation. Pat will talk about his vacation, and we will get caught up for starting 2018. DavidPakman.com/membership and Patreon.com/DavidPakman Show. are the 2 ways to get instant access to the world famous bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.